evolutionists explain the second law of thermodynamics? We observe all around us things go from a state of higher order to a state of lower order. Nothing goes from a state of lower order to a state of higher order unless we intervene. So to say that things naturally or spontaneously ordering themselves higher and higher, when everything we observe, from telling your kid to clean up their room and an hour later it's a disaster, or if you fuel up your car and put it in the garage, come back in a year, the tires are flat, the battery's dead, it's rusting, the gas is no good. How do things order themselves naturally?
So the question is, what do the evolutionists do with the second law? So a little history on this argument. Creationists have brought it up in years past. The second law is essentially things go from order to disorder. And evolution essentially is that things go from disorder to order. You go from pond scum, random chemical reactions, to people. So how in the world can that occur? They respond by saying, well, the second law applies only to a closed system. And the Earth gets bathed with rays from the sun, and so therefore the second law doesn't apply. Which isn't really a rigorous way of dealing with the question. It's an issue the young Earth creationists have raised, and so their response is just a way to get people off their back. But still, intuitively, you've got the problem. This is not how the universe seems to operate. Yes, you got rays from the sun hitting the Earth, but the only reason it's useful is because you have plants with a highly designed biochemical photosynthetic system to harness the sun's energy, convert it to chemicals we can use, and life proceeds. So absent that complex biochemistry, what in the world is the sun hitting the planet going to do? The sun hitting the Middle Eastern desert sands doesn't produce a skyscraper. So I don't think they really have an answer for that. They just appeal to that exception. And so to make them deal with it, I think the creationists have to come up with, I said the creationists, I'm part of them too, maybe a more rigorous form of the argument. They've been able to find a little loophole to deflate the punch of the argument, I think.
You don't observe it. You don't observe anything.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So there still is the intuitive problem, but they haven't dealt with that intuitive problem, and I think the way to get them to deal with the intuitive problem is to find a really precise way to say it to make them have to deal with it. But by and large, they don't, and my guess is they'd probably say, maybe over a long period of time. There's a story I read in one of the Answers in Genesis magazines some years back that I think kind of illustrates this. And the story goes as follows. There are two gentlemen talking. I guess they were standing next to a bathtub, and the believer says, do you really think, he says to the unbeliever, do you really think that the chemicals in this bathtub could produce a fish in 1,000,000 years? And the unbeliever thinks and says, nah, but in 1,000,000,000 years it might. So even if the argument were stated with even more force, I wonder if they would retreat to that. And who can really comprehend what 1,000,000,000 years is? And so then it gets fuzzy again. So my impression is the way they deal with it is by blowing a little smoke, and a little smoke makes things fuzzy, which makes the problem harder to see. Who did you say was next? In the back.
Jeanson, thank you for your introduction. Very helpful. We've really enjoyed it. A lot of great conversations already from your teaching. I would guess that looking at the scriptures, you have developed your own theories about this geological rate of change, and that it's not constant, and that it has not remained constant. So that's my first question. Can you develop some thoughts on what you would speculate the rate of change, the geological rate of change is, based on scriptures? And then secondly, if you applied that to your genetics data, how would it affect your genetics data instead of having a constant rate of change in your genetics data?
Let me make sure I understand the question. So are you asking about radiometric decay specifically, or are you saying geologic processes like erosion and sedimentation?
All of the geological processes
okay.
that you referenced, that they have this assumption of constant
Okay.
rate of change, which you obviously question that.
Okay.
So I would assume from scriptures that you've developed some speculations, some guesses about what those rates of
Okay.
change really have been in history. And if so, then how would that also affect your genetics data if you change that and apply it to your genetics research?
Okay, so two questions. One is, if the assumption of a constant rate of change is invalid or unjustified, what is the real rate of change? And secondly, how does that affect genetics, if you invoke that? I don't have the numbers for most of those, so let me divide the geologic question into two parts as well. So if you look at the biologos chart, you've got radiometric decay, and then a number of processes that don't point towards millions of years. You've got ice cores, which they'll say maybe 300,000. They'll say tree rings, 12,000. Corals, maybe 20,000. So for one of the processes, you've got numbers that are orders of magnitude different from 6,000 years. For the others, they're still fairly close, relatively speaking. For the ice cores, so we have a climatologist on staff who's dealing with this question more, and I'm told these big thick layers of ice, they compress over time. So near the top, you can see the distinct layers. Near the bottom, they get squished and pressed out, and they're virtually indiscernible. And you've got to use some sort of some other method to count them. You can't 1, 2, 3 like that. You can do that near the top. But that's probably, my guess, okay, so that would be post-flood. And we're doing follow-up work on Ice Age modeling. So, make a long story short, creationists would say there was an Ice Age immediately post-flood, and that the flood, if you look in the big picture, is probably the only good explanation for it. You need to have warmer winters. It gets too cold, it won't snow. And you need to have cooler summers. You don't want it to melt away. And a warm ocean would be that sort of heat sink to help moderate it. And I'm probably slaughtering the physics of that, but I'm a biologist, so yeah. Anyway, the point being, what happened immediately post-flood is very different from what we see today. And we've had guys on staff, and have a guy on staff currently, though he's not working on it presently, who've done sort of the hard number crunching with some of the bigger computer systems we have to say, how hot do you need the ocean to be to dump this much snow in California? They've used that, I think, I don't remember why, because we probably have weather data for that. So how many ice core layers do you need per year? Obviously not annual. Instead we need, I don't know that I can fill in the blank offhand, but if you message me, I might be able to give you a better number. The tree rings, again, 12,000 years versus 6,000. You just need basically, 2 rings per year perhaps. That's not a big difference. The coral rings, that's actually a Rob Carter question. I'm deferring. He's a marine biologist, and he wrote a paper on this recently. There's another aspect of that argument. They say you can correlate the coral growth rings with changes in the Earth's rotation or the length of the day. So there's actually 2 parts to it, which we didn't get into. And he's got an explanation that's technical and that escapes me at the moment. But I know where the paper is, so I can find it if you're interested. Radiometric decay, this is still let me think, did I cover it? So stalactites, stalagmites. A lot of those I think we've hit. Seafloor spreading. Again, this is probably rapid splitting during the flood. Meters per second is what I was told. But the whole Earth is underwater, so you've got meters per second. And here's a reason why the days of Peleg in his Genesis 10, in his days the Earth was divided, why that's probably not referring to plate tectonics, because you got these plates, all of a sudden, whoop, you're going to create very catastrophic tidal waves and kill a lot of people. So this is probably during the flood. And radiometric decay, if you've followed ICR, we did a rate project, a 7-year project, trying to answer the question, well, if the method as it's currently practiced doesn't work, what needs to be tweaked to make it work? And the working hypothesis is maybe the rates of decay have changed. As a biologist, I'm still troubled by that because you give off these massive doses of radiation, how is anything going to survive? And some have said, well, if it's occurring in the Earth's crust and you've got a mile of water on top of it, water can absorb it. But you've still got potassium in Noah's blood. I'm still not sure that's been worked out. That doesn't change the fact that as the evolutionists practice it, it doesn't work. But there's still some work being done. Now, we have just hired a new guy who's got a nuclear physics background, and I've heard chatter in the hall of questioning some of the other assumptions. So one of the other assumptions is not only do they assume constant rate of decay, but I've just heard talk of there have been ion exchanges depending on how these rocks are formed. And I'm getting way above my head because, again, I'm a dumb biologist, not a physicist. And that's something that appeals more to me, something other than accelerating decay, that maybe it's how you've mixed these elements, how the rocks were formed initially, something we haven't yet discovered, probably because there aren't a whole bunch of nuclear physicists walking around with answers to these questions. So that was a long I don't know answer to the first question. The second question, how does that affect genetics? I don't know that. So if there was accelerated decay, the first thing that comes to mind is X-rays and such things, UV light, are mutagens. Some of these accelerate, you release ions during the decay process. This seems like this would mess up your DNA. That's possible. Again, my concern is there's a fine line between you've made a few DNA changes and you've just zapped Noah and fried him. That would be a very bad ending to the flood story, and obviously not what the scripture says. So I'm still hesitant on the radiometric decay question, which means then I don't know that we need to invoke changing rates. And as the data show, assuming a constant rate seems to be very precisely what we see today. And what I'm more tempted to invoke when it comes to genetics is, and to consider, is what happens to those creatures that were off the ark that did not experience a genetic bottleneck. So for mammals, amphibians, reptiles, people, you go back to a single sequence, basically, to, well, I guess for humans, you got to go back to Eve because you got those 3 wives. But for dogs, you probably go back to that single female. For horses, probably back to the single female. The other 3 creatures I looked at were probably all off the ark. So they probably didn't go back to 2 at the time of the flood. They go all the way back to creation. And then we have the question of, did God create every single individual water flea at creation genetically identical? Did he create a single species? Or did he create multiple species within the same kind initially? And that, to me, would affect the question more immediately, and that's probably where I'd go first before dealing with this accelerated radiometric decay that kind of bothers me. So that's a little bit less of an I don't know question. And I'd be happy to follow up with numbers and people I can talk to who are smarter than I am. Other questions?
We have time for one more.
You get to do the dirty work and pick the person.
I can be unpopular. And the green shirt over there.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I would say that the Lord brought me to himself 40 years ago through a conference at First Presbyterian Church where Dr. Henry Morris spoke. His undermining of evolution for me and other Christian interaction with him and the Lord brought me to himself. But I appreciate your work. What I wanted to ask is, where do you get you able to confront evolutionists? It seems that creationists have their journals, evolutionists have their journals. I mean, I think the data you present is very elegant about the number of mutations and the rate data with the amount of healing. Are evolutionists interacting with that data? Do you have a conversation with those back and forth? And where does that occur?
So if I understand your question, it's what do the evolutionists make of these data? What's happening in terms of interaction? And I think I can answer it with a story. I gave a similar talk on geology in Montana at the end of 2012, and there was a gentleman in the audience who was old Earth and didn't like anything I had to say, and got up, gave his little spiel, which is just what the atheists do. They give their spiel, make their point, and then they ask a question. So he was going on and on about how no one's embracing this, and young earthers aren't having success, and young earthers gone through graduate school, and now old earthers and leaving the faith. And so what do I make of all this? And the salt flowing into the ocean is wrong. Well, hindsight's 20/20, and so of course, if you ever have an argument with someone, you always win the argument after the fact. That's why I got that from someone else. So of course, I won the argument after the fact. If I had been thinking more on my feet, I probably would have responded this way. I would have said, let me first address your salt question. You're raising a question that many others have raised in times past, and actually the authors of the original paper dealt with in the appendix. So now let me deal with your original question, which is, why didn't so many people not embrace this? Because they don't read our papers. That was really the answer. This guy was raising an objection that had been answered years ago, and obviously he hadn't paid attention to what we had written. So I don't know that many people read it. Again, part of me wonders if it's that 87% question. How shall I put it? Let me tell another story. I have a friend who was in another Harvard PhD program. He called me recently. He was struggling academically, and he told me this story and the struggles he had initially in graduate school. He said when he walked in, it was a little bit of a surprise. He had grown up young earth creationist, and he expected to walk in seeing all these basically angry evolutionists. And instead, he found a bunch of scientists motivated by the desire to know and not antagonistic at all, just doing their work. But they're all evolutionists. And he struggled with, how can all these people who are contributing to society and just making good discoveries, how can they all be wrong? What do you do with this? Sort of a different way of saying that the issue I raised earlier. Why do 87% of scientists hold to naturalistic evolution? Again, I think so many of them just have been taught, have never heard that there's another story. So one more story and I'm done. We were in Minnesota, 2012 of March, and there were some staff in Bemidji. There were some staff at Bemidji State who were nearing retirement, so they can get away with things now that they wouldn't be able to do earlier in their careers. And one of them was in the biology department. He had me come in and guest lecture and essentially give this talk, a modified version of it, to his students. So this is a secular college. And I think the way he introduced it, he said some of the students in his class had requested that so-and-so come in. So this wasn't to try to keep it, to make sure it was legal and above board. So there were some Christian students in the class, but most of them just your average students from Bemidji, not necessarily believers. So they heard this genetics talk. So I got feedback from the student afterwards. I said, what did they say? What did the students think? She said, I think they were all just really shocked. They'd never heard this before. They just didn't know what to make of it. That there was another scientific, scholarly view that was totally different from what they'd ever heard. It just was a foreign concept. So we don't get, to make a long story short, we don't get a lot of interaction with the evolutionists. I mean, again, the Bible's banned from the science classroom in the public schools, basically. And I have a feeling a lot of people just aren't aware. And so we don't get that many interactions. Even in graduate school, when I talk with my friends, I'd bring the argument to them and they wouldn't really have answers, but I don't know that they really cared. So I would like to see many more interactions. I'd like to see the issue brought to the fore. When I had these data peer-reviewed, I asked for more peer reviewers than normally they ask, because I know that if this eventually gets out there, it will get peer-reviewed in the most strict manner by our opponents. But it's hard to find them. I have a friend who's a theistic evolutionist. He was a young earth creationist, grew up Lutheran, now he's a theistic evolutionist. I sent the paper to him. I said, could you review this? And never heard back. So this is something, and I mean, he's got a young family, so there may have been other considerations, but it's not a lot of that going on. Something I guess we could pray for, to see it happen, because it seems like there's an enormous amount of ignorance, and something that, if that's addressed, the Holy Spirit could use to help people see how much, to see the validity of Scripture, and that it's not this ancient myth that is the popular stereotype. Well, I took that last question and turned it into a long lecture. So thank you for your patience and your time.